I am too. Seems a little excessive, but two of them are very old. So
well, so we're going to start in a minute or two. But while we're waiting for folks to gather, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in these individuals, and that led you to dedicate so much time to writing these two books.
Okay, but we're not live now, are we?
We are live.
Oh, right. Because what I was going to ask you was, I have this wonderful National Women's History. I don't know if you can see it. The banner of the suffrage ratification banner. So I just wanted to show that before we get started, and then proceed. And the reason we have that is that on October 28th, 2 days after the actual ratification, there was a nationwide celebration that most people don't know about. I write about it in my book, but bells and whistles, celebrations erupted all over America. And we had one in Englewood, New Jersey, which is where I live, which is literally right across the river from New York City. And it's also located just maybe 2 miles from Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house that she built.
So you were destined in some way, right? Let me kind of start things out, and let me introduce myself. I'm Lee Wright, the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History, and we are excited to have with us tonight Penny Colman. She is the author of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, A Friendship That Changed the World, and also The Vote, Women's Fierce Fight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Penny.
I'm delighted to be with you. Delighted to be with you all. It's a very rainy, cold night here, so I'm hoping everybody else is having good weather someplace, except obviously not in Louisiana.
Well, I'm sure that's the case. So what I thought would be helpful is let's kind of set the stage here. This was actually a very, very long effort that ultimately culminated. My sense is that, especially with the centenary, the centennial this year, there's more of a focus on the last few years that led to it. But take us back to the beginning and kind of what ultimately led to things like the passage and the celebration.
Right, great. No, that's a wonderful place to start, because I start the fight in a different place than virtually, I think, everybody else who talks about it. Because typically the fight, the discussions and books about the fight start in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, where resolution number 9, written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and seconded by Frederick Douglass, called upon women to exercise their duty to fight for the sacred right of the franchise. But I actually start the fight in 1648 with a woman named Mistress Margaret Brent. And Mistress Margaret Brent came with her sisters and brothers on one of the first ships from England, the Dove, that docked in what is now called historic St. Mary's City. It's actually an area of historic restoration. And she was an independent woman, never married, which meant that she could own property. There are many court records of her going to court and getting money that people owed her. She was quite efficient. And all of this is documented as a businesswoman, managing legal affairs. So much so that when the governor, Leonard Calvert, who was the brother of Lord Baltimore, who had been given this land, died, on his deathbed, he appointed Mistress Brent as his executrix. And in the process of being his executrix, she was also then the lawyer to handle his affairs. And at the same time, what was going on is there had been strife, there had been religious conflict. Before Calvert had died, he had hired mercenaries, but he hadn't paid them. So there was this very dangerous situation with these mercenaries about, threatening the colony. So Mistress Brent sold some of his cows, got the money, paid off the mercenaries, saved the colony, and she went to the Colonial Assembly. And she demanded not only a voice in the Colonial Assembly's business, but she demanded 2 votes. And so I start the fight with Mr. Sprent. And actually, there's an extraordinary historic landmark there that I've actually visited several times over the years. I've gone to historic St. Mary's City, which is right down at the southern tip of Maryland. And it's a beautiful gazebo. And in this wonderful gazebo, this wonderful structure, there's a brick base with 2 big plaques that have the whole story of Mr. Sprent, and a bas relief showing her with her, skirts astride, approaching Governor Greene and demanding her voice and 2 votes. This is significant to me because it obviously very much makes this demand for the vote a much earlier demand than 1648. And it's also significant in me in terms of telling the story, because 20 contemporary suffragists that we're well aware of, knew her story. She was remembered. This gazebo actually was dedicated in 1982. But in reading about the suffrage fight, one of the things that I found that was particularly interesting is the suffragists were what I've called, they were historically reverent. They were reverent. They knew their history. In 1915, a group of Maryland suffragists actually called their march the Margaret Brent Pilgrimage. And under that title, in 1915, of course, they're taking the colonial woman's and honoring her demand for the vote. And they actually marched from Baltimore to historic St. Mary's City, and then traveled around the southern part of Maryland, trying to elicit support, raise money. And there's actually a new historic marker that was just erected in historic St. Mary's City in the end of, the end of 2019, marking that event. It says, Margaret Brent Pilgrimage. So that's why I start the fight then. Then, of course, there are cases of colonial women voting. There's a huge highway sign, a great big highway sign, as you're driving into Uxbridge, Massachusetts, that announces Lydia Taft, T-A-F-T, is the first woman to vote in America in 1756. And there's a stretch of road that leads from Uxbridge to Smithfield, Rhode Island, that's named the Lydia Taft Road. So again, there's this, the first idea of women voting did not just occur in 1848. And then, of course, famously is the decision of the writers of the Constitution in New Jersey in 1776, who wrote it in a way that African American and white and Black women who owned a certain amount of property, had certain amount of financial resources, 50 pounds or so, could vote. And again, there are records of women and African Americans voting in New Jersey. The vote was taken away in 1807 due to what the losers of an election perceived as voter fraud, which had more to do with the fact that they had lost than that there had been a lot of voter fraud. And I also want to make a point about the New Jersey situation of women and African Americans having the vote and having it taken away. This is a through line in the fight for the vote. This territory of Washington, women were enfranchised in 1883 by the legislature. The Washington Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional in 1887. This is probably one of the most infuriating part. Well, there are many infuriating parts of the fight for the vote, but this was one of the things that I did not know about until I started to do my research, was this winning and losing. Um, in in Utah, women won the right to vote, were enfranchised in 1870, and Congress decided in 1887 they outlawed polygamy and women's right to vote, so that women who had been voting in great numbers for 17 years, the Congress just said, nope, no more. So the right to vote is a very, very, very fragile piece, essential but fragile piece as you understand this story of the fight for the vote in this democracy of ours.
Allow voting in statewide elections?
Voting, any kind of voting in statewide elections, of course, we're well aware of the many ways at municipal or state or federal elections that people's vote can be limited by all kinds of things. The placement of boxes, the regulations in terms of registering. I mean, there are just so many ways that the vote has been restricted by laws and by court decisions. That's really what I'm talking about in terms of the fight for the vote. Like, it was the territorial legislature that enfranchised women, but it was the Supreme Court that then said no. It was the territorial in Utah, but it was Congress. So what I'm really talking about is this back and forth. It was a Supreme Court decision in 1875, Minor versus Haberstadt, that ruled that yes, and this was a voting case brought by a woman who had been denied the right to vote, Virginia Minor. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And of course, her husband, who was a lawyer, had to file the case because she, as a woman, was not legally allowed to file a case. But she had tried to vote in 1870 and had been denied the registration. So her husband filed this court case. It ends up in the Supreme Court. And in 1875, the United States Supreme Court ruled that women, yes, were citizens, but the right to vote was not part of the privileges of citizenship. So that's the piece that I'm really talking about. And of course, it's a very contemporary issue. We've just had two recent Supreme Court rulings, I think yesterday. So this intersection, and I think one of the key things that I think really helps all of us sort of understand, and I certainly needed to understand it, was that the Constitution of the United States, it was the decision of the founders to give the decision about voter qualifications to the states. And that's, imagine it would have been a very different story if the right to vote had been enshrined in the Constitution, but it wasn't. The decision was to give the states the rights. So it's been hodgepodge ever since of what the regulations, the qualifications, et cetera, and the thing that has happened with the Constitution, for example, with the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, also the amendment, 21, but then in terms of limiting age, but all of those are just saying to states what they can't do, but they still have a lot of latitude about what they can do.
We talked about New Jersey, which obviously is very much on the East Coast, yes, and had a significant population, relatively speaking. And then we have the territories, Utah, Wyoming, and so on. When I first heard the history, I kind of imagined why maybe a territory, again, say Wyoming, might believe, well, since we're kind of starting out here, let's include the right to vote to women. How is it that New Jersey on the East Coast was kind of, it sounds like the only East Coast state to grant women the right to vote?
Well, of course, after the Revolution, all the colonies, it's that post-revolution period when all the colonies wrote new constitutions. And why New Jersey made a different decision than the other colonies, historians disagree. There's some historians think that it was the Quaker influence in New Jersey, that there were some leading Quakers who were part of writing the Constitution. So there are some who think that. For a period, there were some people who would say, oh, it was just a mistake. They really didn't think about what they were doing and that it was a mistake. I personally am of the mind that there was the influence of, although then it gets a little complicated to say it was the Quakers, because of course then there were Quakers who didn't vote because they didn't believe in supporting governments that waged wars. So it's all complicated, but there were in fact some Quakers who had egalitarian views, this notion that the spirit is in both male and female, and had more liberal and progressive views, who in fact believed that the franchise should be extended to everyone who had a certain amount of money. The tie with money and property is out of that thinking that if you own something, if you have some kind of wealth, then that means you are more independent minded. If you're someone who doesn't, this was a predominant notion during that period. And if you were somebody who was dependent on somebody else for your living expenses or your house, then you would not be independent. And of course, this was a time when married women under the law, with the English common law that was brought to, that the colonists brought with them, is that when a woman was married, she became assumed into the legal identity of her husband and had no rights. She was not a legal entity in and of herself and didn't even own her clothes or any money she earned. Even a pregnant woman, a husband could decide that that child would be indentured when it got to be a certain age. So it was a time, but there were exceptions to those beliefs.
Let's go forward then. At what point did this really emerge as kind of a national discussion, emerge on the national stage? Was it, to what extent was it kind of keyed off the Seneca Falls meeting? Was it before that?
Well, one of the things that I did in writing my book, which again was a little different than many of the other books that have been written, is I became quite fascinated by doing archival research on newspapers, because I was really curious about how well known was this story. Was this just an isolated story that wasn't being picked up by newspapers around the country? And in fact, what I found was that there was coverage all across America, and including in the territory of Alaska. Then later it gets picked up in Hawaii, the story gets picked up. That in fact, from the beginning of the emergence of the talk about women's rights after the Civil War, it's something that's very much covered in newspapers. In my book, I talk about the fact that the first petition that Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, right after the Civil War, delivered to Congress, gets covered by newspapers around the country. One of the things that and the vote, a newspaper in Vermont comments about women being enfranchised in Wyoming in 1869. So there's a lot of coverage and coverage going on about this emerging phenomenon of women's rights. A lot of it gets embedded in the fear that it will unsex you. This gets talked about a lot, and senators and representatives, the the ones who were very much against women's rights, property rights, any kind of rights, suffrage, they frequently come back to, there are two things they'll come back to. One is that it will unsex. It'll make men women and women men, and, you know, men who wear petticoats and women who smoke cigars. So there's a lot of anxiety reflected in the coverage around that. And then, of course, then the emergence of open talks about white supremacy, which is openly talked about throughout the fight for the vote, that the enfranchising women will then jeopardize the ascendance of white supremacy in the southern states, which, and of course, the southern states, there's a swath of the southern states up to Delaware that never that don't ratify the 19th Amendment at that time. And I think it's Mississippi doesn't ratify until like 1984. Another one actually ratifies the year my first son was born, 1969. So these are themes, and the newspaper coverage continues even during World War I. There'll be newspaper, and in my book, I do that. I don't know. You'll see it throughout my book. I have headlines because I can't really show you, but I'll use headlines because I'll be wanting to make that point, that I put headlines in capital letters because I'm wanting to make that point that this story, this monumental story, this complicated. The story of just such duration and such scope and such complexity that was never part of my education as a historian or my kids or my grandkids. This massive, significant story was, in fact, a well-covered major news story throughout the fight for the vote.
And we have these talks on Thursday nights, and I enjoy so much, and I think all of our listeners do, the opportunity to understand in a much more holistic way, right? Much deeper understanding, rather than just kind of across the waves that one gets in the more kind of popular historical things and so forth. So this is really, really helpful. Now you have a couple of people that you follow, and I guess they referred themselves as Napoleon and the General. Is that right?
Yeah, right. Elizabeth, yes, Elizabeth and Susan. And as I was saying, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton earned enough money with her lecturing that she bought a piece of property just a couple miles from where I live right now, and lived there. She bought it in 1868 and lived there from 1867 until 1787. And also, just again, a couple miles from where I'm now sitting, she attempted to vote in 1880. And I must have to, I'm interrupting myself because I'm noticing that fan in the background. I'm wanting to tell people who are watching this that I ended up having to use my basement computer, which was not my intent. So you're seeing you're actually in my studio in the basement where I actually wrote the vote. We have a big, well over 100-year-old house, and I've written books on every single floor, but this was in the basement. But at any rate, so back to this. I actually write about that. And if anybody picks up one of my books, I always encourage you to write my author's note because I spend a lot of time. And in this one, I write, this is a true story, a war story. At least that is how Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony described their long fight against beliefs, customs, and laws that oppressed and discriminated women, disenfranchised women. They wrote and spoke about ammunition and bullets to fire against the enemy and engaged in combat and tyrants. They met in councils of war and organized raw recruits and set squadrons in the field to seize the fort. They were called Napoleon and General, and without shedding any blood, they kept each other on the war path at the point of a bayonet and led a revolution that transformed the lives of women. And this truly, Lee, is one of one of the things that really amazed me with both books, I had no idea when I started my research, and I've been immersed in writing women's history for many years, many biographies and articles and social histories, and I had no idea that that Elizabeth and Susan and the people with them, this continued in terms of the fight for the 19th Amendment, replete with military language. Yet they were absolutely nonviolent in the face of great violence, being, the night of terror when women were beaten up by guards, the mobs that attacked the demonstrators in the march in 1913. There was lots of violence against suffragists, but never was there any violent return or any kind of retaliation. Yet their language across the board, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was non-militant, Alice Paul, who was militant, across the board, they're using these kinds of words. What I was reading, the military language I was reading, all of that was in quotes, because all of that is what I've extricated from their writing. So it was one of the things. And I had written, of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Fight That Changed the World first. And I really didn't expect to find that phenomenon continuing with my next book, The Vote, but there it was. Really an interesting thing. It's just a really interesting thing for me to think about, that mismatch, it would seem to me.
Indeed. I want to go back to the comment about unsexing, and let's also talk about the public reaction to these attacks and so forth. It is surprising that anyone would think that voting would be the thing that would kind of upset the roles as they were viewed then. Why is that? It just seems odd that the simple kind of civil act, right, of going and casting a ballot, all of a sudden, men would be wearing petticoats, as you said. And so
yeah. That's a great question, Lee. And I have a one-word answer: control. I could add another word: power. Again, I think we're seeing that being acted out again. That we're talking in the 1800s. If we go back to that moment of the prevalence, and a lot of even in my lifetime, I could not get a credit card in my own name as a married woman. These changes of women being seen in the eyes of the law and the financial system. I remember living in Oklahoma, and I started a publishing company, but I couldn't get a loan without my husband's signature. And when I was accepted at graduate school, I was told that I got a half scholarship, not a full. Now, to my credit, I did ask why, and the person casually said, well, because you're not supporting a family. But nobody was supporting a family at that time. We were graduate students. But so this secondary, this non-legal, this non-financial status that women were put in, the vote and the belief was that their husband would represent them. So if women then are enfranchised, that's the threat to that control and the expanding of who has the power to then make these legal laws and regulations that determine life. So, and I think the reason that it always seemed to get tied into sex was, again, that was perhaps the scariest consequence that they could think of. The scariest consequence would be at the core of your identity, who you are sexually. the emasculation of men. And I have to say, I grew up with a father who was a psychiatrist. So I sort of grew up in a milieu of those kinds of notions of masculinity is defined by this and femininity is defined by that. And we need to, main that. And that's what keeps social balance. That's what keeps order. And again, if we look at the history of this country in terms of voter disenfranchisement, who most frequently gets targeted to lose their vote? It's most typically people who are outside the traditional power structure, who by allowing them to come in is a threat to that existing power structure. And the ultimate threat at the basis of our identity is who we are as a biologically identified person at those times, as male and female.
Let's go then to something you referred to just a minute ago, which was the physical violence. And we see these ladies in these long dresses and hats, and it's just inconceivable that somebody would think that they needed to physically attack that person, or that in any way was the right thing to do. So what if we talk for a couple of minutes about the attack of the marchers and so forth, and then go to the workhouse and what happened there, which was not something everyone would see in public, right? But the attacks on the marchers was by definition very public.
Right. Yeah, and that again, when I talk in other venues about my book, the Vote Women's Fierce Fight, and originally the title of that book was Shout the Revolution, which for years I always called it Shout the Revolution, which was a song that suffragists wrote when they were in prison. And again, because I had not been prepared until I started to do my research for the amount of violence. And again, I sort of grew up with that notion, which is a little silly because I had 3 brothers, and I certainly knew about, had tangled enough with my older brother to not totally believe that men wouldn't hit, but I kind of thought they outgrew that. So I really wasn't prepared for the violence that was so frequently inflicted on. You're right, that your description was absolutely right. These were very women, always immaculately dressed with their hats and their dresses. Annie Arneal, who worked on the factory, when she was in a march, she would be dressed in the same kind of uniform as everybody else. The suffragists felt very strongly that presenting themselves in terms of decorum was, again, a way of minimizing the fear that they were going to destabilize the existing order. They very much wanted to have people think about, we're really not going to overturn the existing order. And so when the crowd with the 1913 march, and this is the march that Alice Paul instituted her brainstorm the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration on March 3rd, 5,000 women. And these marches were beautifully executed, just beautifully executed, precision marching, women on beautiful horses, sections of women with floats, and then women as nurses, and then there'd be, academic, there'd be seamstresses. It's just beautifully orchestrated. There was a beautiful pageant that took place on the steps of the Treasury, the classic image of Inez Milholland on the beautiful white horse leading the parade. And yet, mobs of men didn't hesitate to start swinging and swearing and grabbing and ripping clothes. Inez Milholland on her horse bravely rode into the crowd to make a path. Women ended up going to the hospital. It actually took the cavalry from Fort Meade had to come and restore order. There's also an attack on the headquarters. Soldiers and sailors were a big part of the mobs, men in uniform. Women, when they were silent sentinels picketing the White House, standing with beautiful banners, again, very primly dressed, that they wouldn't hesitate to, tear their banners down, knock them down, break a stick over their head, drag them on the pavement. There was one assault on the headquarters, which was right across the street was actually on Lafayette Park, which is in front of the White House, that a mob of men used a ladder to try to climb up and storm the headquarters of the National Women's Party, and shots were fired. Then there's the infamous attack on November 14th. It actually starts in the night, where a group of suffragists have been arrested, and they were, tried and sent. They were supposed to be sent to a Washington jail, but they were sent to Occoquan Workhouse, which was in Virginia. And when they got there, Dora Lewis, who's one of the many of my favorite people in the book, she was a woman from Philadelphia who was a close leader in close leadership with Alice Paul, said that they were demanding would not give their names until the superintendent came, who was a kind of a thug of a guy, Whitaker. When he finally shows up, he had been at a meeting at the White House, which is significant because he's at a meeting at the White House or discussing what to do with these suffragists. This is November, and they've been picketing since January 1st of 1917. And the arrest started in June. And he comes in the night, and the women, some of them are resting on their backs on the wall. They're, lying down, they're exhausted, they're tired. And he orders this gang of men to basically beat them up, grab them, threw them into cells. One woman, Dorothea Day, who, goes on to become the great, the Catholic worker movement, gets thrown into a cell. Lucy Burns gets handcuffed and hung from her thing. They're threatened with gags and straitjackets. It's a, brutal assault on these women. A corps of Marines are outside guarding so that nobody can come in. Lucy Burns finally smuggles out. There's a woman named Mary Dolan, who's a 73-year-old woman who has a shorter term. So she gets released early and then starts to come out and tell the world what's gone on. But again, the kinds of assaults continue. There's a terrible melee in 1919 in front of the old Metropolitan Opera House, where women are there to protest a speech by Wilson, who's on his way back to England to negotiate. He's trying to get the Versailles Treaty passed in the League of Nations. And again, peaceful women suffragists in 1919 are beaten up by, again, a mob of men. The police frequently the police are either standing by or they're engaged in it's dragging women, beating, smashing a pole. They take the poles and crack them over their head. So the police rarely would intervene, and not so rarely would be part of the attack on the women. And the one that's they're all kind of shocking and sickening. But I find the one at the Metropolitan Opera House, where a woman named Doris Stevens, who's again a young woman and a leader, is walking back to headquarters and gets, knocked on the head, smacked on the head and knocked to the ground. so it's again part of the story that doesn't get told, but I think I told it in my book, and it was really hard to write. It was really hard to read, and the newspaper articles covered this. I have in one of the PowerPoint presentations I have this big Washington Post newspaper headline, banner headline with big capital letters, mob attacks women. So and they're covered with newspapers all over the country, and they are being covered abroad. This is widely reported in the newspapers across America, in small newspapers in North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, Oklahoma. One of the women who is in the Night of Terror, Cady Stanton from Ardmore, Oklahoma. Big headlines about this. So it's a hard part of the story, and it's a hard thing to kind of know about, to write about, and then to think about that.
Okay, thank you. That is definitely a hard part of the story. So it was interesting to me to hear where you started the story. I have never thought of it going back that far. So thank you for sharing that. That was very interesting. So one of the questions that we wanted to talk about is, you have some people in your books that are not as well known. Can you tell us about maybe one or two of your favorite lesser known people who were part of this crusade?
Maud Malone. I love Maud Malone. Maud Malone, New York City, and not just because she's from New York City, but she's tall, blue-eyed. She's, wears glasses. This librarian who grew up in an activist family. Her father was very active in fighting for Irish independence, and her cause was suffrage. And why Maud Malone is she's important for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that the suffrage movement, like all social movements, has problematic areas, and certainly one of the problematic areas is the existence of racism in the suffrage movement. And, anti-immigrant talk. Elizabeth Cady Stanton has sort of really hurt her legacy with some of the, the racist attacks, the verbiage that she spewed over the fight of the 14th and 15th Amendment. But Maud Malone was truly universal in her belief in her organization. She founds an organization called the Harlem Equal Suffrage League in 1905. She's the first person in New York who does open air speaking. And again, the first one is in January, and it describes pink-nosed and blue-cheeked women. It was so cold. She organizes the first parade. And she is very determined in her conversations that this movement is going to be inclusive around race, around immigration, around class. And she's, again, and some of the things that she certainly should get credit for have been attributed to other people, but the newspaper accounts clearly are clear. And again, in my book, there's a whole section where I write, it's headline after headline after headline of Maud Malone being arrested, Maud Malone going to jail, Maud Malone this, Maud Malone that. She also is the one that instituted heckling. During Wilson's first campaign, there's an incident where he's speaking at Woodrow Wilson. He's speaking at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and it's a mob, of course, of men listening to him, and Maud Malone is sitting in the balcony. And she would always wait until the politician said something that she could then key into. And I think Wilson said something about enfranchisement. I don't remember exactly what. And Maud Malone rose to her feet as she did, and she said, what about women? What about enfranchising women? the crowd erupts and booing and hissing and, screaming, throw her out, throw her out, throw her out. Big burly police officers come. This is all from newspaper descriptions. I'm not making this up. This is the newspapers describing. And, they grab her. These 5 police officers grab her and take her out. She ends up spending the night in jail. So she arguably, from my research, is the first of the suffragists to go to jail. And so she's one. Another is an incredible woman, Anna Julia Cooper, who's African-American. Her first 7 years, she lived as a slave. She goes on to be a very important voice and fighter for the vote, educator. She ends up actually earning a PhD in Paris from the University of Sorbonne at the age of 65. Ida B. Wells, of course, legendary African-American fighter against lynching. Of course, I mentioned Dora Lewis. Another story that's interesting is Louisine Havemeyer, Louisine, Louisine Havemeyer, who is the wife of the owner of made a fortune in sugar, which of course is complicated because of course the making a fortune off sugar means that you're involved in the slave trade. But she ends up being this incredibly wealthy woman and a widow. And she also becomes involved with Alice Paul and the militant. And one day, I guess it's this period of 1917, and Alice Paul has this idea that she's going to take a train, and it's called the Prison Special, and she's going to have women who have been in jail go on this train and travel around the country and give speeches. Alice Paul was a genius at coming up with tactics and events and strategies to get public attention. So she calls Louisine, and Louisine has told her that, she'll support the cause, but she doesn't want to go to jail. But the story about Alice Paul that person after person after person affirms is that if you looked into her eyes, she was irresistible. And if Alice Paul asked you to do something, she did something. So Louisine packs a bag, leaves her Fifth Avenue mansion full of expensive cars. She has an incredible art collection, just incredible amounts of wealth, goes to Washington, actually leads the march, gets arrested, and does, in fact, spend the night in jail. And Alice Paul wanted her in particular because, first of all, that got a lot of press coverage. And plus, Louisine Havemeyer could be a little risque. She was a great speaker, and she was very funny and witty and could be risque. So we get this mix from Annie Arneal, who goes to jail like 8 times, and again is one of the victims of being beaten up. Actually, she gets beaten up by Capitol Police picketing in front of the Capitol. So there's her, but then there's Louisine. Then there's Mabel Pinghua Lee, who's a Chinese student at Barnard who rides a horse in the 1912 parade. So there's this whole array of interesting women. Abigail Scott from the state of Washington, Dunaway, Abigail Scott Dunaway is a wonderful character. One of the things I've been doing for 30 years is driving all over the country looking for landmarks to women. You can see a lot of those. Actually, I have an Instagram account and a lot of blogs. I have a lot of blogs and pictures. Actually, Carrie, you can find the gazebo, the wonderful thing to Margaret Bryn on some of my social media posts. So just wonderful ones who I knew nothing about and was thrilled to get to know when I think about them.
Thank you. And I have put the link to your Instagram and some more of your videos in the chat. So anyone who's interested in that, look in the chat and you can check out the pictures and so forth there. So
Great.
that is fantastic.
Great.
Thank you so much. This has been enlightening. So much to take in and to learn. And of course, there is much, much more in the books that Penny has written, and we've got a link to those in the chat as well. So check those out. If we didn't get your question answered tonight, check those books out, and I think you'll find what you're looking for. So next week, we are going to have Shirley Ann Higuchi here with us, and she has written a book that has just come out about the Heart Mountain Japanese American Internment Center in Wyoming during World War II. So that will be very interesting to listen to as well. And then just a heads up, we're going to change things up the week of Thanksgiving a little bit. Obviously, we usually do this Thursday night, and that will be Thanksgiving. So that week, our broadcast will actually be on Tuesday. So that's November 24th. And we'll have Donna Curtin here from the Pilgrim Hall Museum talking about the Mayflower, the first year that the Pilgrims were here, and what that was all about and what that looked like for them. So that's going to be a great one, and you'll want to tune in for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for your time and effort, Penny. We have really appreciated this.
Thanks, Penny. It is so appropriate that you and your talk were here tonight, and then next week we have the election.
Well, Lee, you and Carrie are very good at what you do.
Carrie, all Carrie.
Oh, okay. We followed your the program that you did when you went to the historic sites.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
America's summer road trip.
Yeah, your summer road trip. We followed your summer road trip because, of course, I'm very close to the Bergen County Historical Society.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful.
And we spent a lot of time at Salem, and you did a fabulous job. So I'm really happy to know about you. One of my sons is a history professor, so I'm spreading the word about you all. So
fabulous. It's so nice to join us tonight, Penny.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.